Court hearings in the fight between the City of Toronto and Uber came to a conclusion yesterday, and now the fate of Uber rests in the hands of one judge at the Ontario Superior Court. Ed Prutschi is with me to talk about this. Ed, let me start with this. Is Uber here to stay?
Yeah, I think they are. As much as the law has tried, not just in the Uber case, but in many cases to turn back the dials of time, the law is not capable of doing that. It'll always try to catch up. Mm-hmm. So in some way or another, I think Uber is still going to be on the streets of Toronto and across Ontario and frankly around the world. The question is, what kind of regulation, if any, is Uber going to be subjected to? Mm-hmm. It looks like in the hearing that we've had for the last 2 days, the judge is very sympathetic to Uber and has asked a lot of pointed questions towards the city side and seems to be leading, if I'm reading the questioning correctly, to saying, you know what, at this point, the kinds of regulations that are being suggested, i.e. that Uber is a full-fledged taxi cab company, not going to fly.
And let's get into that a little bit, because I've been reading sort of some of the arguments that Uber's been putting forward. One, they say this is a violation of their charter right to freedom of expression, commercial expression in this case. And the second is they say they're not a taxi service, they're a technology company. Is there an argument to be made there?
They're both sort of cutesy creative arguments. I mean,
I like them.
Yeah, the freedom of expression argument is one that I think was obvious. People saw it coming. I'm not sure how easily that's going to work. I mean, taxi cab drivers, whether they're Uber or otherwise, like anybody else, have freedom of expression. It doesn't mean they can't be regulated. Regulation applies to all sorts of types of speech, and there's all sorts of things we know we can't do, especially when it comes to commercial speech, which doesn't get the same level of protection as, for example, political or religious speech. So it's an interesting argument. I don't know how far it will go. Then Uber makes this argument that says, hey, we're not a cab company, we're a tech company. I find that personally and legally to be a very difficult argument. I mean, it looks like a cab company, it walks like a cab company, it's probably a cab company, as they say. But the interesting argument is on the specifics of the regulation. It deals with the act of communicating for the purposes of doing a commercial ride, essentially. And Uber, I think, has an argument to say that, hey, we're not the communicators. All we are is a company that sort of connects point A to point B. We connect customers to people who want to be part of their customers. Right. It's a ride-sharing service. That's what they keep calling themselves.
When people talk about this coming down to health and safety, Uber does background checks. They do criminal background checks. Whether or not they actually follow through with those criminal background checks, I guess, has yet to be seen. They haven't provided that information, but we do know that they do request Uber taxi drivers to go through these background checks. And to be completely frank with you, the regulations on this industry, on the taxi industry, are so onerous. They're so ridiculous. And I think that there is an argument to be made that they're so onerous that there is an attempt to perhaps try to keep drivers out of the market so that they rise the price, so that the price rises.
So, look, I'm not sure about what motivation we might impute to regulators as to whether they're trying to drive market price up or not. They're going to tell you at any time regulation is just there to protect the consumer, to protect the public. From Uber's perspective, clearly they're at this point completely unregulated. The cab industry itself in the city, I think everyone would agree, is heavily overregulated. Is there a happy medium somewhere in between that both Uber and traditional cab companies could comply with? There probably is, but that's not the state that we're at now. So at this point, it really is an all or nothing. Either Uber is a cab company and has to do everything that the cab companies have to do, or it's not, in which case it's completely free to do whatever it wants. I think the better argument on the whole, from a social perspective, society's perspective, let's come up with regulations that make sense for everybody, for Uber and for the cab industry.
Well, what would those regulations look like? Because right now taxi drivers need to pay tens of thousands of dollars, or at least thousands upon thousands of dollars, to get their Uber license, or to get their taxi license, rather, to be able to drive a cab. Uber drivers don't actually have to go through that, and I think that there's an argument to be made that they don't need to go through that. As long as they have their background check, let's let the market decide and see which one takes over and wins.
Right, although there's a couple of examples there, right, that we're trusting Uber on right now, and they haven't been particularly good for their own cause in terms of willing to disclose this. So they say they do background checks. They've hired a company called First Advantage who's responsible to conduct those background checks. First Advantage works for all sorts of different companies in this same sphere. Are they actually doing the background checks? When they get negative results, what do they do with them? If you have any violation, are you then prohibited from being an Uber driver? How regularly do they check? These are the kinds of things that I think regulation might be appropriate for.
Uber has been operating in Toronto since 2012, and to the best of my knowledge, there's been no problem.
Well, I don't know about that. I think there certainly have been people who complain about Uber drivers. There are people who complain about traditional taxi cab drivers. There will be bad apples in any group. We talk about this all the time. So it's just a matter of time before an Uber driver gets charged either with some sort of criminal negligence, impaired driving, a sexual assault. It's going to happen. I mean, it's inevitable. The other question that I think comes up often is what level of insurance are Uber drivers carrying?
Right, I was just about to ask you about that.
Yeah, the company's been very cagey about that. We don't know. The company itself likely has its own insurance. Does its insurance cover its cab cab drivers? Is it asking cab drivers to present only personal insurance? Are those cabbies in fact taking out commercial insurance? If I'm a lawyer for an insurance company and I find out that an Uber cab driver has been involved in an accident and now I'm facing potential liability, the first thing I'm going to ask is, wait a second, you told me you were driving for personal reasons. Now it turns out you've been making $300 or $400 a day as an Uber taxi driver, driving far more mileage than we thought in a commercial way. You've injured yourself, you've injured somebody else, you've injured a passenger, we've got damage claims. If I'm the insurance company's lawyer, I say, forget it, you've got the wrong policy.
So are you saying that individual Uber taxi drivers should be mandated to get commercial insurance, or should the company have commercial insurance for all of its drivers?
I think probably the answer is either or. So either the company's got to go out there and say, we're going to have commercial insurance that covers all of our drivers, and the company foots that bill and presumably makes it back by the profit they get off their drivers, or they're going to have to regulate and insist that their drivers carry not just a personal policy, but a commercial policy that designates them as an Uber driver. That's more expensive.
Sure.
It's going to eat into the profits of the individual drivers, but that's up to them to make. That's a decision they'll have to make.
And I can see that I'm okay with that type of regulation because I think commercial insurance in this case is probably a good thing, though they do argue it's a technology company, not a taxi
tech
service.
company that drives cars
and
can hit
the judge seems
people.
to be sympathetic to that, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Final question, prediction on what will happen as we anticipate the judge's ruling.
I think right now you're going to see Uber free and clear. I think the judge, based on the questions that he's been asking and putting out there, does not see Uber in the same role as a traditional taxi company. He's willing to shake things up legally, so I think we're not going to see regulation. What we are then going to see is an appeal, and what we're going to see in between the appeal and that time is City Hall trying to come up with some sort of regulation specific to Uber that will work.
Can they repeal the judge's ruling by the way of changing bylaws, for
They
instance?
can. So the way the ruling works now, it's predicated on what the law is today. If City Hall or the province, for example, tomorrow introduces new legislation, then that new legislation, assuming it's in compliance with the spirit of this decision, will fly and will govern.
Right.
So new legislation could be the answer.
All right. Thanks, Ed.
You're welcome.